Phyllis, LaTricia, thank you so much for coming onto the show. Phyllis, you are an educator, a workshop facilitator, and writer, and LaTricia, you are a multi-talented entrepreneur. And together, you are the hosts of Living the Principles, a bi-weekly podcast about strengthening the Black community and Black lives with a focus on the 7 principles of Kwanzaa. The two of you recently celebrated over 2 years of running this show, so congratulations, with over 50 episodes that cover everything from Kwanzaa, Juneteenth, Black businesses, and Black movies and TV shows. Looking back at these last few years, what would you say was the most challenging part of this podcasting journey, and what's been the main benefit you've taken away from this experience?
Wow. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you for having us. It is such a pleasure to be here. And looking over the past couple of years, so much has happened, I think, in our lives personally, with deaths in our family and different situations that we had to adjust to. I think those are a couple of the things that have been challenging. And then when all of the stuff broke out with George Floyd and the pandemic, and those things were challenging. So there have been a few challenges along the way when it comes to the podcast. But at the same time, it has just been an amazing experience because we have just been able to share so much information and get to know so many people who have come onto our podcast. So it's been a real roller coaster for me.
How are you, Phyllis?
I would say the same, especially during the pandemic and the upheaval with George Floyd. I felt that I was extremely stressed, but we still tried to um, focus on the principles, but also focus on ourselves too, because that's part of the principle too. So we don't want people just to be so focused on activism that they forget themselves and neglect themselves.
And on your podcast, you've analyzed everything from movies, books, TV shows about Black stories and characters. But you, again, do it from the lens of Kwanzaa's 7 principles, which are unity, self-determination, collective work and responsibility, cooperative economics, purpose, creativity, and faith. And so far, you've talked about Concrete Cowboys, the new Netflix movie starring Idris Elba, the Uncle Tom documentary, 90s Black love movies, and the self-made series about Madam C.J. Walker, just to name a few. Having seen so many types of representation of Black life and history and love, what are some of your favorite movies or TV shows, like old or new, that you would recommend as a great example of Black empowerment? And why would you choose that?
I oddly wouldn't recommend anything that we watch. Not that I don't love them, but the first thing that comes to mind is Many Rivers to Cross, because I think Black people have to learn to love themselves and not view themselves from the lens that the world views them. So I think watching more documentaries about who we are is something that we should watch more of.
Yeah, I totally support that contention because as I think about the television shows and movies, a lot of them really aren't very empowering. But I do think the Madam C.J. Walker series was empowering because of how she set out coming from a background where her parents were enslaved, and she came out and just did her thing and became a millionaire and didn't really take no for an answer. She just kept going. So that was a powerful story to me.
And are there um, any preferences for whether or not you feel like, oh, I feel like the generation in the 90s did it better, or what's happening right now is better? Do you have any preferences for certain eras of Black representation that you feel are like sort of the golden era?
I think everybody does it differently, so there's no comparison. I don't think there's any comparison. I don't think anybody does it better or anybody did it worse. I just think that we all do it differently. Like, I'm from a different generation than you're from,
Mm-hmm.
I imagine, because you look younger than I. And I just think that we all have something different to offer during each generation. And if we take a little bit of what everyone offers, then I think that's what helps us to be more united. I think division comes in when we start talking about who did it better and could it be worse if this. So I guess that's the perspective that I come from. Is I'm from a we're just different perspective.
Mm. So, speaking of media representation and Black history, during your three-part review of the Netflix Madam C.J. Walker series, Self Made, you discuss your really complicated opinions and feelings about the historical accuracies and inaccuracies of the show, the gender roles, the writing, the casting, and everything in between. And on the podcast, you have a really cool rating system of good to go, so, or no go. And at the end of your review of Self Made, you both rated the series as so, even though you did also mention that you appreciated the overall impact of the movie's existence. And so when you're watching these films, what are some of the red and green flags that you're looking for? Like, what qualities do you think make something a really solid, good to go movie versus something that you feel like is a no go when it comes to Black empowerment and representation?
I think one green flag is did they do their research? And when we were comparing some of the research with what happened in the film, that she did live in a lot of different cities, and that was her second husband. Some of those accuracies are green flags. Some things that are red flags for me is when you try to make current issues into historic films. I think if that wasn't a conversation, then that just don't try to bring it in. So that's one thing for me. But I think we're going to see it through 2020 or 2021 lens. That movie came out in 2020. So when people are filming it, they're still going to see it through those lens, even though it was the 1800s. So I think that was part of it. And one of the reasons I said so, because some people will do their research, and other people will just run with what they saw. And one issue that I know was buzzing with Self Made was colorism. And the lady who inspired and taught Madam C.J. Walker, she wasn't fair skinned. So I know for a movie you gotta have things that'll draw people in, but I think people just need to do their research. So at the end, I just like they did have the details, but just to remind people, do your own research.
Well, I think with some of the stuff that we look at goes beyond the empowerment and representation. It also goes to the casting and acting, and I think part of that is what contributed to that particular film being like a so. And also, I think the historical inaccuracies. Not that that was a bad thing because it wasn't a documentary.
Mm-hmm.
It was a film that was fiction. So taking that into consideration, I think that matters. But to answer your question, I think what I what I look for when it comes to Black empowerment is it empowering? Are we being empowered? Are we showing power? Is there a lot of victimhood going on, or are we just really showing who we are? So for me, that's part of it when it comes to empowerment. And then representation. How are we being represented, and who are we representing? So because there are so many different people in the Black culture. So how are we being represented? Are there women? Are there men? Are there people in the LGBT community? Who's there? Who are you casting, and how is that all playing out? So all of that matters, and who created this film, who directed this film, who produced this film, because sometimes films that have some Black cast are not necessarily produced or directed by Black people, and I think that that's important too. So the representation in front of the camera and behind the camera, all of that stuff matters when it
Mm-hmm.
comes to representation.
Oh yeah, and you made a really good point. I like what you said about the you know holistic approach to representation as something that isn't limited to whoever's on the screen, but who's also writing and who also is on the production side. And you were talking about how um, every film, every piece of media has to sort of be looked at as its own individual thing. That they're all they're different and they're not necessarily competing with each other. But once we get into once we get over the first hurdle, which is we need the representation, and then once we can start to actually analyze the quality of it, like how is the casting, how are the talking about our stories, and one of the things I think is really interesting is, especially for Asian communities, because there's this new Marvel Shang-Chi movie, and it's the first Asian American superhero, and it's bringing up conversations about representation and the fact that some people want only good representation. Like, oh, I want us to be seen as like powerful and rich and amazing. And other people want more nuanced representation where it's like, I want to see, kind of the pain, and I want to see more of the nuance because that's also valid and important. We don't have to always just resort to showing ourselves as being awesome and amazing, but also the vulnerabilities. Are there movies that you feel like really speak to you on that level where it's like, okay, it's great for representation, but there's also something deeper to it. Like I felt like maybe a TV show spoke to a certain experience that you feel like doesn't oftentimes get addressed. Are there any shows or movies like that that you feel like fit that?
Well, I think one of my favorite movies is Jason's Lyric, and I love that movie because of so much that it entails. And although a lot of it is about poverty and destitute and all that stuff, there's also this huge element of family and love in that movie that I really like. So I do think it's important to show all of the nuances, but at the same time I think that there needs to be this diversity. So every time you turn around, like when we review like the 90s movies, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those movies they're so similar in what was going on. And I think we talked about how there's a lot of pain and a lot of struggle and a lot of trauma and drama. And I think that if we go, that is part of the black experience, but it's not the totality of the black experience.
Mm-hmm.
And while we don't have to be superheroes and always, at the top elevated, I think that we need to have some diversity. So give me that, but also give me something minus the pain, because my life is not centered around pain. So there's more than pain and trauma
Mm-hmm.
in our culture. So show us more of that. Show us more.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that because I feel like for me, like I would love to have more Asian American stories that are actually more slice of life, more just like everyday people and just their everyday struggles. Because I appreciate the movies that are about like Asian American immigration and these really difficult moments throughout history. But especially as someone who's living in the now, I would love to see more things about like what's it like being an Asian person working in corporate America. What's it like being an Asian person, at a college trying to join the sports team. I feel like these are the stories that are very relevant and happening and unfolding right now. Is there anything that's going on right now in America that you feel like, oh, I would love for there to be more representation or more movies or more films to like talk about this part of the culture or talk about this part of the experience?
I would love to see more movies centered around people who are leaving corporate America, leaving public offices or public jobs and venturing out on their own, and what it's like to go out on your own and start your own business and excel or fail, whatever the case may be. But like you said, I would appreciate more of the everyday normal life for people who not the stuff that we expect, but something that's kind of the unexpected.
Yeah, I think that's definitely relevant to everything that's going on right now with a lot of people leaving their jobs. Um, and so I wanted to segue into some of the topics that you discuss related to Kwanzaa and the seven principles. Because right now in 2021, we are in a very peculiar moment in American history where there's a massive cultural and political tug of war. It's happening in local politics, it's happening on our school boards and media and the workplace and academics. And looking at all the problems going on in the world, from climate change, capitalism, healthcare, homelessness, racism, misogyny, you can start to recognize that there are also opportunities for change hidden within those margins. If you could dedicate your time and your energy into addressing some of the needs within the Black community related to some of these problems, and if you could just like laser focus on those things for the next 5-10 years, what particular things would you say you'd want to focus on, and how would you incorporate some of those seven principles?
I would probably focus on poverty because I think I think poverty is I think poverty creates so many of the other issues. So I think when you're in poverty, your it affects your health, it affects your education, it affects your work, it affects everything. So if we can focus on poverty and find ways for people to get out of poverty, to know that there's something beyond that, then I think that's where I would focus, because I believe once people get out of poverty, because we've seen it, we've experienced, some of us have experienced it. Once we got out of poverty, our lives changed for the better. So I think that would be my focus.
Yeah, and oftentimes that really is where the central point is that influences so many other issues, like whether it's housing, whether it's your ability to go to a certain school or access a certain job. People forget that, and it sort of goes into what was going on during the pandemic when people first started to get those stimulus checks and they started to see like, oh, wow, like money actually does help. Just no strings attached really does make a huge difference. Now, switching lanes a bit, I want to discuss education, specifically the reframing of education in America today. As we all know, America's education system is a cultural battle zone, and it's specifically related to the Republican fight to ban any books or classroom discussions that involve critical race theory. And that means that the history of slavery, indigenous American genocide, and the internment of Japanese Americans are all under threat. These are important moments in our history and in American history, and they're on the verge of being silenced from classrooms. And so some teachers in America are just being fired for talking about slavery and for talking about racism. And it all boils down to this idea that white supremacy and our white supremacist system is afraid of being exposed. They're afraid that we will teach the next generation the real version of American history that we had to learn on our own. So from your perspective, like how do you, on the subject of reframing education, how do you think we get out of this mess? Like, how do we undo this mischaracterization of Black history as being anti-white? And how can we do this within the education system?
Wow, look at God. Ask that question to Phyllis. She's the educator.
I think one way is to see who's in the school system, the superintendents that we have, the people on the board, and if we could change some of those people, I think we can make a big difference. And the second thing is, I think some people don't want to see it differently because, as we explain things 2 or 3 different types of way, people still are stuck on their own views. So I think by changing some of the people that are in the leadership positions, we can make a change on what people view as anti-white, and also just the everyday conversations that people that are willing to fight systemic racism have with their family. And what I am starting to see a lot more now, even before critical race theory was a buzzword, I had started to see children, parents are having them like wear t-shirts like racism sucks and stuff like that. So I think some people do want it, and we just got to go to our particular our school systems, see who's on the board, see who's blocking it. There's curriculum and instruction. We have to examine it because and see why did they approve it? Why are you guys approving something that says slavery was migration? So those two things affect who's impact who's on the school board, and see what's in the curriculum, and ask why are they choosing that particular curriculum.
And now I want to go ahead and jump into the other question, which is related to Kwanzaa and the seven principles, because right now we are in 2021. We're in this really peculiar moment in American history where there's a massive cultural and political tug of war, and it's happening in local politics, local school boards, in media, the workplace, and in academics. And looking at the problems going on in the world, from climate change to capitalism, from healthcare and homelessness to racism and misogyny, you start to recognize that there are a lot of opportunities for change hidden within these margins. So if you could dedicate your time, your energy, your money into addressing some of the needs that you see within your community, and if you were to focus on that for the next 5 or 10 years, like what would you want to focus on, and how would you incorporate some of those seven principles?
I would want to focus on education. I think naturally I'm just a teacher, but I've also been doing it for about 15 years. And I think that, for example, cooperative economics, if we could teach people, I don't think you can, let me say this, I don't think you can manage your way out of poverty, but I think we could help some people live a little bit better or have at least an emergency fund if something comes up. But cooperative economics is something that we could educate people on. And having faith, I think we don't look at each other in good light sometimes. I think that's any particular group of people, but as a Black person, I see that. And there's so many unity, working together, teamwork. Corporate America is hiring people just to work on unity and things like that.
So my last question of the day is on a much lighter and a tastier note, and this one relates to a topic that I think we all love, which is food. Uh, During your joyous Kwanzaa episode, you mentioned that on the sixth night of Kwanzaa, you have an incredible feast. And you also mentioned how diverse Kwanzaa celebrations can be, since Kwanzaa is a cultural holiday, not a religious one. So that means Kwanzaa can be celebrated with Black folks from all walks of life, all religions, all cultures, and all cuisines. So my question is, if you could design the perfect Kwanzaa plate, complete with a side, a main, and a dessert, what would you want to eat?
For me, I am. If you can't tell by the twang, I'm definitely from the South, so I would like Southern food, and I also like different food from around other parts of the world, Caribbean food, and I've never had fufu yet, so I'm willing to try new stuff as well. So I would like a cuisine that represents Black people around the world, like different rices, different meats, our favorite fruits from around the world. So, and in the islands, it may be mangoes, but in Georgia, it may be peaches. So, I would just like to show that we're just so diverse as people.
And how about you, LaTricia?
Pretty much the same. I would like to have something from different cultures, but and so if I had to choose like specifically what I would like to have, I would definitely have collard greens. I would definitely have like some Jamaican oxtails, the African chicken. It's Nigerian. I can't think of the name of it, but it is so tasty. So I would have that and some type of rice. And I'm not really a big dessert girl, but if you was gonna go ahead and throw in some little southern, let's go ahead and have a sweet potato pie or and some what's I, what is the cake? Why can't I think of pound cake? Oh yeah, throw in pound cake. And for drink, let's go back to Jamaica and throw in some of that sorrel, little floral-y drink. It's pretty tasty.
Awesome. Well, Phyllis, Tricia, it's been an honor having you on the show. Before we say goodbye to our audience, what are you all working on, and how can the LLAG community support and find you?
Well, I was impressed by the way that you named the Kwanzaa principles because although I've been doing this for 2 years, I struggle with remembering them. So one day I recorded like an impromptu story to remember the Kwanzaa principles, and we are going to create a children's book about the Kwanzaa principles. So that's
Wow.
what we're working on.
Oh my gosh, that's incredible. And where can they hear about this book? Where can we find you on social media? And maybe if somebody wants to support this project, how can they help out?
You can find us on our website is livingtheprinciples365.com. We are Living the Principles on Instagram, Facebook, and LTP Podcast on Twitter. And we also do have I forgot the name of the account, but we also do have accounts too for donations because illustration can be pricey. So we are accepting donations. So if you guys want to reach out to any of those platforms, you can inbox us or email us.
Awesome, awesome. Well, again, thank you so much for coming onto the show. We'll definitely have to invite you back some other time. Again, thank you so much. Have a wonderful week. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you and bye.